Adapting. Quite literally a survival instinct of all living things. While most people would think of adapting in a new foreign environment, we as humans decided to put adapting into our art, which is now manifested in the modern day as movie studios redoing their old movies and making them horrible. In Art of Poetry, Roman poet Horace states, "It's hard to write of familiar concerns in a new and original way. You're better off telling the story of Troy in 5 acts than being the first to voice something new and untried." He may have been alive during the BCs, but people could be fooled into thinking that this is a quote from some modern film producer or something if you consider the amount of retellings and reboots there are flooding the industry, as stated earlier. Don't know why the word industry is so hard for me to say, but it is. That was like my 5th take. And it's not hard to see why. Familiarity is something we can all take comfort in, but then when we are introduced to something new and fresh, it could be awkward. Like middle school level dance awkward. However, let's not forget that some milked franchises started out as risks or no idea. 2008's Iron Man or the original Star Wars were not guaranteed to create the big universes that spawned as a result of their success. Heck, video game series Final Fantasy was a game developer's literal final attempt for financial success, and well, look at all those examples and see how they're doing now. The entertainment industry needs new intellectual properties and ideas to stay fresh. One such historical narrative risk was Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, an 1899 book. It tells the story of fictional character Charles Marlowe in a quest to the Congo on a job from the Continental Trading Company, sometimes also referred to as the Company. The book is often praised as a critique of colonial/imperialism and its effect on humans, written at a time when most European writers would not want to be critiquing a thing that their country was kind of, known for doing a lot, but, that's just me, However, we're not just talking about Heart of Darkness. I would also like to bring up its famous film adaptation/reimagining, 1979's Apocalypse Now. For the uninformed or unaware, you may be rather confused as to why a supposed film adaptation of a book called Heart of Darkness has a completely different name, in addition to having new characters in a new setting that was not present in Conrad's original writing. Trust me when I say that that was my first thought when I saw the film. But believe me, these two pieces are two sides of the same coin, that also stand on their own, away from the shadow of the other. This shows that someone can write of familiar concerns in new and original ways. And I will be illustrating how Apocalypse Now succeeded in both retelling and reinventing Heart of Darkness at the same time.
We're just clones, sir.
As mentioned earlier, Apocalypse Now and Heart of Darkness have little in common on a base level. The most obvious base level similarity being the name of the main antagonist/central character of the story, both being named Kurtz in both pieces. But as we all know, there's more to something than what we see at face value, much like each character in these stories. For starters, each story involves one man traveling to a foreign land and interacting with the natives of said lands in dehumanizing ways. Heart of Darkness has Marlowe leading to Congo, while also being a huge racist, while Apocalypse Now has Willard traveling to Cambodia, while also kind of being a big racist as well. This tells us that both are putting their main characters through an adventure that defamiliarizes them from the comfort of their home, and could be one reason why they act so differently from their traveling companions. Another common theme present in both pieces is how they are critiques of certain topics, but they can also be argued that they are perpetuating said criticisms and topics. Heart of Darkness is heralded as a brilliant criticism of imperialism and colonization through showing the horror of Kurtz's actions and philosophies. On the other hand, Conrad's writing includes many racist terms and slangs in reference to the Congo natives. Apocalypse Now has a clear message of
War is hell.
At the same time, however, the production of the film was long, cruel, and even involved the inhumane killing of a real water buffalo. Now, it has been proven time and time again that one can separate art from artists, especially when considering the actions of the artist. However, in this case, you can't really do that, since the writing of a book and the production of a film are tied directly into how the art was created and therefore its creator, as well as since you put your name on something, you are not only feeling proud of what you're writing, of what you've written, but you're not only proud of what you've written, but also proud enough to, put it out in the public and put your name on it. There is one more thing I want to bring up in terms of the similarities, but I'll get to that in a bit.
I'm different, yeah, I'm different.
Much like there are obvious similarities, Apocalypse Now has many unique traits separate from Heart of Darkness. While we could bring up the obvious things such as location changes or name changes, that barely even counts because the setting and characters may change, but the narrative will be kept intact and be almost the same. While Marlowe is one of the characters with the most dialogue in Heart of Darkness, his equivalent in Apocalypse Now, Willard, is actually one of the more quiet members on board his ship. On the topic of the ship crew, Apocalypse Now uses them as more than just a person for Marlowe to bounce stories off of. Willard's temporary crew is described as a bunch of green hordes, fresh to the battlefield. What I found interesting about the relationship between Willard and crew is because of how Willard is a seasoned captain traveling with newly recruited soldiers. His familiarization clashes against the crew's attitude, which creates a defamiliarized vibe for the audience and Willard's crew. In other words, Willard is taking something that is familiar to both him and the audience, that being the concept of war, and shows the audience his whole view on it and takes away the familiarity of war despite everyone from the audience to the other characters in the movie being familiar with the concept of war, at least in their minds. Someone could be watching Apocalypse Now and think to themselves, well, it's another movie about war. So I expect the characters to slowly lose their will and happiness as they see the horror of war. That initial prediction would be held true for the Greenhorn boat crew, but Willard is not visibly vibing with the vibe of war. It's almost as if he's on a completely different wavelength. If you examine the movie with reader response theory in mind, Willard's different vibes become all the more clear. Take these two scenes, the boat investigation and the Playboy show. When the Playboy show begins, all the soldiers are going nuts and crazy and thinking, oh my god, it's whammon. Meanwhile, Willard is not having any of it, standing when everyone is sitting and sitting when everyone is standing, very clearly not interested in the prospect of whammon. The soldiers even grab onto the helicopter like a bunch of zombies and recreate that one stereotypical helicopter scene that every zombie movie has. A more extreme version of this disconnection is when the crew investigates a local's boat for anything sus. I'm so sorry I had freaking wrote that. Oh god. Then this happens. Then the chief says this.
We're taking her to some friendlies, Captain. She's wounded. She's not dead.
So then Willard then does this.
The book says, Captain.
In both of these scenes, we can see Willard's obvious disconnection with the rest of the people on the ship, which makes sense. A captain sees war and certain army ideals in a different way than someone who has just grabbed the gun for the first time. And we, as audience members, can visibly see that, like, obviously something is up with him because he's not acting the same way and he's not trying to, like, be friendly or anything like that, or, like, he's just, you know, being himself. It can be argued that Marlowe also brings an air of defamiliarization to the other characters on his boat, but for me, it's a little harder to understand what the other characters feel about Marlowe, mainly due to the fact that they have next to no lines or characterizations, whereas in Apocalypse Now, we can visibly see the shock on these poor little boys simply because, once again, it's a movie. What may seem like a huge difference at first is how Kurtz dies and eats. In Heart of Darkness, Kurtz tells Marlowe that he's, quote, waiting for death, and after having a vision, or a future side orgasm as I like to call it, he is pronounced dead. In Apocalypse Now, Willard kills him. I mean, obviously, it's kind of his mission after all. At first glance, it may seem like Heart of Darkness ending is more like,
I should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light!
and Apocalypse Now ending is more like,
Die, monster! You don't belong in this world!
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets. But enough talk. How about you?
But here's why I wouldn't call this a difference, but rather a similarity. Because the death of Kurtz in both situations has the same effect on our main character. In Heart of Darkness, Marlowe and the boat crew spent a majority of the time praising Kurtz and his ideals, like, oh my god, he's so cool, like he's so wise, and like, whoa, he like changed the world, like, you know, they don't say that, but like, that's kind of what it feels like. So by the time Kurtz dies, Marlowe is basically there to live on as his words and teachings, and maybe even ascend Kurtz by becoming better or smarter than him, thanks to the said teachings mentioned earlier, and because he spent so much time surrounded by people that admire Kurtz. And this is all just from the readers sort of responding to the way Marlowe talks about Kurtz and the other people talk about Kurtz, because obviously there is no definitive ending to what exactly happens at the end, but from what people can, like, tell, most people would be like, okay, so Marlowe is basically just Kurtz now, because it kind of makes sense. In Apocalypse Now, after Willard kills Kurtz's followers, which are majority natives, acknowledge him as the new leader and clear the way for him to walk and lay down their weapons while literally bowing to him. And even though we see Willard walking away, not technically accepting his fate, but at this point he's already Kurtz. Someone who killed people in order to achieve his goal and lost a bit of himself thanks to that. Also known as what happens to Kurtz in Apocalypse Now, which is what prompted the whole movie to start. With all this comparison and stuff, you would think that I would find these two tied together and should always be together and be compared as such. Well, that's not necessarily true. It's pretty much a given to say that Heart of Darkness can stand on its own without needing an adaptation to update it. It wouldn't be taught in classes if that wasn't the case. And since Apocalypse Now is the second child, it is of course going to be compared to Heart of Darkness in terms of quality and if it meets the expectations of the original. I think it not only meets the original's quality, but it can also stand on its own without needing its big brother to protect it. Take away the name Kurtz and take away the knowledge of the movie's origins, and what you get is a film about the effect of the battlefield and what it has on soldiers and how the soldiers cope with the wartime. Any audience member can pick that up from just responding and watching the film and just analyzing it. You don't really need Heart of Darkness for something like that. It also compares a veterans and a Green Horde's mindset of the war and how the new crew takes every outlet for escapism while Warlord sees through any distractions as just that, distractions, and attempts to focus on the mission as best as he can so he can return home despite everyone around him clearly not sharing his level of focus. But as he says at the beginning of the film,
when it was over, I'd never want another one.
In essence, Apocalypse Now is a story of the display of a hardworking, loyal soldier's descent into madness in the attempt to fulfill his duty. We see how crazy and insane he is at the beginning of the film when he's just in that room. He feels like he has no purpose, like he has nothing left to do. But when he's given a mission, suddenly he feels like his connection to the world is restored, no longer feeling so defamiliarized with the world that he needs to harm himself with holding a mirror in his hand and looking at it after he punched it, which, by the way, was kind of like, ugh. The story of Heart of Darkness still works in the setting of the movie, but the setting of the movie invokes different themes at play throughout the plot instead of trying to be a criticism of colonialism, which wouldn't really work since it was made and released in a country that wanted to be independent because being part of the UK wasn't fun, so Americans would obviously know that colonization is flawed. Not to say that America is perfect or anything, but that's off topic. Objection! Some of you may be arguing that Apocalypse Now barely shares anything in common with Heart of Darkness and shouldn't be counted as an adaptation of Heart of Darkness, which therefore doesn't disprove Horst's statement about familiar concerns since it is something completely new in a completely different way, also known as something new being foisted upon and it was untried, at least most likely at the time. In addition, there are plenty of examples of movie studios especially trying to reinvent and retell stories in new and original ways, but they all flop as both an adaptation and its own entities. And to those people, you're right. Horst's quote is stating that trying to reinvent old stories is difficult and more work than it's worth when you can just retell the same story and have it work just as well as it did back in the day when it was first discovered. Compare Disney's classic animated films, timeless, still as good as they were when you first saw them for the first time, and their life lessons are still intact. Good. Then look at the live-action remakes of said films. Probably the most dated example of trying to modernize a classic you can think of, and will most likely be forgotten about by the end of, 2021. I mean, do you remember Aladdin? I barely remember Aladdin. There was a freaking Beauty and the Beast live-action remake. I barely remember that. The only reason I remember that is because Emma Watson and Ewan McGregor are in it, and that's the only reason that's the first thing that sticks out to my mind. So that kind of goes to show that they're not exactly timeless as the original, huh? And it's not as if all an adaptation needs to be successful is to just be super different like Apocalypse Now was. Look at live-action Cinderella or live-action Mulan. Both are vastly different from the original, but mostly different in the fact that they're bad and not fun to watch. Mainly because one movie has James Corden, and the other one is just a terrible movie with a bad premise and attempt to be more serious. Instead, they made it seriously awful. As I said, if your opinions match the points mentioned in the previous section, you are right to think that way, and obviously you have your own reasons for feeling that way. That being said, here's what I have to say about it. Yes, Apocalypse Now can barely be seen as an adaptation of Heart of Darkness, but by connecting it back to Conrad's original book, you are able to get more out of the movie. If I watched Apocalypse Now without seeing Heart of Darkness, my analysis would be something like, it's like a film about how war is bad and stuff, and how nothing will make it any better. But thankfully, as I am a 10 IQ college student that was required to read Heart of Darkness in class, I can see how the movie, much like Heart of Darkness, shows not only someone's descent into a foreign setting, but also their journey creates such a huge force of defamiliarization that they also go on a journey into madness and insanity. Such analysis is only possible with knowledge of both book and film. Without that context, Willard is just a standoffish and cold guy, even though we do see that when he's not serving his time, he's literally going crazy. but I don't think the audience would be able to see his loss of insanity as clearly over the course of the mission due to how, compared to the rest of the crew, he seems like the calm-by-the-books member of the group and not someone looking for their purpose in life, despite the beginning of the line basically spoiling that he lost himself after this mission. There's a reason why something like the hero's journey is still a narrative framework used in stories to this day, because of how effective it is even if the supporting cast and setting is changed. But this, of course, is only how I personally feel. As I said at the top of the video, innovation and risks need to be taken in order for the entertainment industry to thrive and prosper, unless people want to watch the same 10 movies for the rest of their lives. But as I have demonstrated, Horace is not completely right when he says that it is hard to write old familiar tales in new ways. Otherwise, something like Apocalypse Now would not stand out in the way of its core. But as I've demonstrated, Horace is not completely right when he says it is hard to write old familiar tales in new ways. Otherwise, something like Apocalypse Now would not stand out in the way its current form does, and narrative structures such as the hero's journey would not be so widely used. People want innovation. People want to be surprised. One of the most common complaints about reboots, besides their existence being a mistake, relatable, is that they fail to stand on their own and commit too closely to trying to recreate all of the story beats of the predecessor. Horace is correct in saying that it's hard to write of familiar concerns in new and original ways, but not fully correct when he says you're better off telling the story of Troy in 5 acts than being the first to voice something new and untried. So in conclusion, if you ask me if I agreed with Horace, I would say...
The answer is yes and no.